She had walked the same path every morning for 4 years. But the morning the water stopped, nothing about it announced itself. She walked upstream. She already knew not what she would find, but that whatever it was, it had not happened by accident.
Someone had built this while she slept. Built it carefully. Built it with a county permit already signed.
The offers had never been about the land.
The morning Willa Sterne found the ditch dry, the sky above Greyback Ridge had not yet decided what color it wanted to be. A thin band of gray light pressed along the eastern peaks, neither dawn nor dark, and the air carried the particular stillness that comes before a Wyoming summer asserts itself fully. She had walked the same path to the headgate every morning for 4 years without her husband beside her, boots finding the familiar ruts in the dark without needing her eyes to confirm the way. The routine had become something close to prayer, not the kind spoken in the Lander Crossing Church on Sundays, but the kind a person performs with their body when the mind needs something steady to hold on to. She heard it before she saw it, or rather she heard nothing, which was itself the wrong sound. The headgate at the top of Dunmore Creek ditch should have produced a low, continuous murmur by this point in July, water pressing through the iron frame, breaking over the lip of the channel, beginning its 3-mile descent toward the alfalfa fields and the stock tank below. Instead, there was only the wind moving through the sage, the distant sound of the ridge settling in the cold, and her own footsteps slowing as something in her chest registered the absence before her mind gave it a name. The headgate stood open, exactly as she had left it the evening before. Below it, where Dunmore Creek should have been pushing 4 inches of clear snowmelt through the channel, there was a floor of cracked gray mud the color of ash, still holding the impression of the last water that had moved through it. The impressions were already beginning to flake at the edges. Whatever had stopped the flow had not stopped it an hour ago. It had stopped sometime in the night, long enough for the mud to begin remembering what dry felt like. Willa crouched at the edge of the channel and pressed 2 fingers into the mud. Cool, not wet. She stood again and looked upstream, where Dunmore Creek curved north along the base of the ridge before bending back toward the Sterne property line. The creek itself should have been running regardless of the headgate it fed the ditch, not the other way around. She walked the bank upstream without going back to the house for a lantern, because the sky had lightened enough to see by, and because some part of her already understood that whatever she was going to find would not improve with time. The Dunmore Creek ditch had been the central fact of this land for longer than Willa had been alive. Her grandfather, Willa Sterne, had dug the first section by hand in the spring of 1849 alongside 2 other families, August Pruitt, who had filed the adjacent homestead to the north, and George Halloran, who had taken the eastern parcel along the lower flats. 3 men with shovels, a borrowed transit level, and an argument about grade that lasted the better part of a week before Elias proved his calculation correct by pouring a bucket of water along the proposed line and watching it move exactly as he said it would. The resulting channel had carried snowmelt off Greyback Ridge every spring and summer for 35 years without requiring more than seasonal maintenance, and the occasional cleared blockage after a hard winter brought down debris. Garrett Sterne had tended the ditch the same way his father had taught him, and the same way Willa had learned from watching Garrett by walking it at both ends, keeping the banks clean, treating the headgate with the same regularity given to anything the farm depended on for its survival. When Garrett died in the summer of 1880, 3 days into a fever that showed no mercy and accepted no argument, Willa had taken over the morning walks without ceremony or announcement. The farm did not pause for grief. The ditch did not pause. She had simply risen earlier than usual the morning after the funeral and gone to check the headgate because the alfalfa needed water, and because standing still in the kitchen was worse than moving. 4 years of mornings. 4 years of that low murmur at the headgate confirming that the system worked, that the ridge was releasing its winter accumulation in an orderly way, that the land was going to give something back for what she put into it. The silence where that sound should have been felt, in the early July dark, like a door closing somewhere she could not see. She found the dam a quarter-mile upstream, around the northern bend where a stand of cottonwoods had always made the bank soft and prone to erosion. It was not a natural obstruction. The packed earth wall rose 4 feet above the creek bed and stretched bank to bank with the kind of evenness that required a team of workers and at least a full day's effort. A timber pipe, rough-hewn pine, ran through the base of the dam at an angle, directing what remained of the creek's flow northward along a new channel scraped into the hillside, heading toward the upper pastures of the Fitch Highland grazing allotment. The pipe was the diameter of a man's shoulders. Whoever had installed it had not been in a hurry and had not expected to be stopped. 3 wooden stakes had been driven into the creek bank on Fitch's side of the dam, each carrying a painted board. The lettering was deliberate and large enough to read clearly in the growing light. Fitch Land and Cattle Co., Fitch Highland Grazing Allotment. Authorized. Brecken County Commissioner, June 1884. Below the text, a second line in smaller letters, Trespassers will be prosecuted under Wyoming territorial statute. Willa read the sign twice, not because she missed anything the first time, but because the second reading gave her mind a moment to catch up with what her body had already understood. She had known Cornelius Fitch's name for nearly 2 years, the way everyone in the Asheville Flats Valley knew it, by reputation first, by proximity second, and by a specific quality of wariness that his business dealings seemed to generate in the people around them. He had bought the Adler parcel to the north in the spring of 1883, then the Weston land 6 months later, then the Upper Ridge section that had belonged to the Marsh family since before Wyoming was a territory. Each purchase had been legal. Each seller had, as far as Willa knew, received fair market value. The pattern only became visible when you looked at which parcels he had chosen and in what order all of them positioned along the upper reaches of Dunmore Creek, above the Sterne property line, between the ridge and the valley. He had offered to buy Dunmore Creek Farm 3 times. The first approach came through an intermediary, a man named Osgood, who showed up at the farm gate in August of 1883 claiming to represent a Denver land investment concern and offering $11 per acre on 180 acres of deeded land. Willa had thanked him and declined. The second offer came by letter in February of 1884, this time with Fitch's name directly on the letterhead and a price of $13 per acre, accompanied by a note describing the difficulty of operating a farm without a second income and the wisdom of selling before land values in the valley began their inevitable adjustment. She had folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it in the wood stove. The third approach had been Fitch himself, appearing at the Brecken County Fair in May, managing to find her at the livestock judging ring in a way that required some knowledge of her schedule. He was a tall man, well-dressed by Wyoming territory standards, with a handshake that communicated he expected it to end conversations rather than begin them. "Water's expensive to maintain out here," he had told her, smiling with the ease of someone accustomed to people eventually agreeing with him. "I'm offering a clean exit before the costs catch up with you." She had watched him walk away toward the horse auction and felt, for the first time, something less like irritation and more like the specific kind of attention a person pays to a thing that has revealed what it actually is. Standing now at the dam he had built while she slept, she understood the full shape of what she had been looking at. The offers had not been about the land, they had been about the water. She walked back to the house in the full light of early morning, moving faster than the terrain required, and found Tobias already awake and dressed, sitting at the kitchen table, with his breakfast untouched and his leather-bound notebook open in front of him. 11 years old, with his father's habit of being present in a room without requiring it to acknowledge him. He had Garrett's eyes a particular shade of gray-green that registered information quietly and released it slowly, and his father's way of sitting, with a pencil in his hand even when he was not writing, as though the act of holding the instrument was itself a form of thinking. The notebook had been Garrett's, originally a field ledger he had used to track water levels, planting dates, and the dozen small observations that accumulated into knowledge over a farming season. When Garrett died, Toby had appropriated it without asking, which Willa had allowed without comment. He had continued the recording in his own hand, using pieces of charcoal pencil worn to a nub, filling in dates and notations in a script that was still developing its final shape, but was already more precise than most adults managed. She had read his entries occasionally when he left the book on the table, not as surveillance but as the kind of attention she paid to everything on the farm that told her how things were going. She told him what she had found, not gently, not harshly, the way she would have told Garrett, with the expectation that the information would be absorbed and considered rather than managed. Toby listened without interrupting, which was his way, and when she finished, he turned the notebook to a page near the back and pushed it across the table to her. The entry was dated the 14th of June, 1884. Herd wagon teams on north side of Ridge after dark 2 nights running. Could not see from the house. Sounded like more than 1 team and more than 4 men. Below that, a second entry from 2 days later spoke to Ren Aldrich at the feed store. He said Fitch has men working the upper creek. Did not say what kind of work. Willa read both entries without speaking. Her son had noted this 6 weeks ago and not mentioned it to her, not because he had considered it unimportant, but because, she suspected, he had not yet accumulated enough information to know what to do with it. This was also Garrett's quality, the patience to hold an observation until it had enough company to mean something. She told him to eat his breakfast. There was work that still needed doing regardless of what had happened upstream, and they had not yet arrived at the part of this situation where anything could be fixed by sitting at the kitchen table. He pulled his plate toward him without argument. The county commissioner's office occupied a wood-frame building on the main street of Lander Crossing, 2 blocks from the assay office and 1 block from the livery, in a row of municipal structures that communicated Wyoming Territory's ambivalence about whether it intended to become a state anytime soon. Aldous Tech had held the commissioner position for 11 years on the combined strength of a reputation for even-handedness and a gift for making people feel they had been heard, even when the answer was no. He was a large man, gray-bearded, who wore the same vest regardless of weather and kept his desk in a state of organized complexity, that suggested he understood every document in the stack, even if no one else could locate anything without his help. He received Willa the same morning, which surprised her. He stood when she entered, offered the better of the 2 chairs opposite his desk, and listened to her full account of what she had found at the creek without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment before he opened the left drawer of his desk and retrieved a folder. Permit inside was 4 pages neat, stamped twice, signed at the bottom by Tech himself on the 14th of June, the same date Toby had recorded hearing wagons on the ridge after dark. Fitch Land and Cattle Company had filed for authorization to temporarily redirect the flow of Dunmore Creek for the purpose of improving water access to the Fitch Highland grazing allotment, pending permanent infrastructure development. The filing listed no affected downstream properties. The authorization had been granted 11 days after the application was received. Tech's expression was the expression of a man who wished he were having a different conversation. The county had approved the application on its technical merits, he explained, because no counter-filing had been submitted during the review period. The law did not require him to seek out objections, it required objecting parties to come forward. Since no one had, and since Fitch's documentation was in order, the permit was valid. He set the folder on the desk between them and said, more quietly, that Cornelius Fitch had committed to funding the new road surface connecting Ashevale Flats to Lander Crossing, a project the county had been unable to budget for 3 consecutive years. He did not say this to excuse the permit. He said it, she understood, to explain why the permit had moved through the review process at the speed it had. There was a specific kind of helplessness that was not the same as defeat, and Willa had learned to recognize it over 4 years of running a farm alone. It felt like arriving at a door that was not locked but was held shut by something on the other side that had no obligation to move. She thanked Tech for his time, took the copy of the permit he offered, and walked back out into the July heat of Lander Crossing's main street. The first week passed in the logic of immediate necessity. The alfalfa in the upper field began showing the early signals of water stress, leaves curling inward along their length, a movement so slight it would have been invisible to someone who did not spend part of every day looking at the plants. Willa recognized it the way she recognized changes in her son's expression or shifts in the color of the ridge at evening, not as alarming, not yet, but as information she could not afford to ignore. She hired 2-day laborers, brothers named Taft and Owen Birch, from the Halloran settlement on the eastern flats, to haul water from the community well at Ashevale Flats in wooden barrels loaded onto a wagon. The cost per day was not unreasonable by itself. Multiplied across the weeks she would need the arrangement to continue, it consumed the cash reserve she had set aside for winter feed before she had finished the arithmetic. She filed an objection with the county commissioner's office on the 5th day, requesting an emergency review of the drainage permit on the grounds that it had been issued without proper notice to affected downstream rights holders. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained cuff, who processed her paperwork with the efficiency of someone who processed a great deal of paperwork that went nowhere, quickly stamped it received and placed it in a tray that already contained several documents that appeared to have been there for some time. Neighbors talked. This was inevitable. The Ashevale Flats Valley was not large, and the practical consequences of Dunmore Creek running dry were visible to anyone who looked at the stern fields from the county road. Ruth Cavendish, who ran the adjacent farm with her 2 adult sons, brought a covered dish on the 6th day and stayed long enough to say carefully that Fitch had spoken to the Cavendish family as well, and that his offer on their property had increased in the past month. She did not say what they intended to do. She said it in the way people say things they cannot commit to aloud but feel someone should know. Willa thanked her for the food and let the silence after it say what it needed to. On the 16th day, Willa sold 4 head of cattle, not the strongest animals, and not the ones she had planned to carry through winter, but the ones whose loss she could absorb without restructuring the herd entirely. The proceeds covered the Birch brothers' wages for another 2 weeks. She did not tell Toby how close the numbers were running because there was nothing he could do about it, and because he was 11 years old, which was old enough to carry worry, but not old enough to be handed hers to carry alongside his own. The 19th night, she did not sleep. This was not unusual. She had passed through stretches of sleeplessness before. During Garrett's illness, during the first winter alone, during the bad hay year of 1882. But this particular wakefulness had a different quality. It was not the sleeplessness of grief or fear. It was the sleeplessness of a decision that had already been made somewhere below the level of conscious reasoning, waiting only for the mind to catch up and authorize it. She rose at 2 in the morning, dressed without lighting a lamp, and took the pickaxe and the long-handled shovel from the tool shed. The moon was 3/4 full, which was enough light to walk by on a path she had walked 1,000 times. She reached Fitch's Dam in 40 minutes. The timber pipe was directing the creek northward with the same indifference it had shown for 3 weeks, and the packed earth wall held the shape of something permanent, despite being less than a month old. She chose the southern end of the dam where the earth met the original creek bank because that was where the foundation would be shallowest, and because she was not attempting to destroy the structure she understood, in whatever practical layer of her mind was still operating on strategy, that destroying it entirely would solve nothing and create legal problems she was not positioned to absorb. She was attempting to reopen a partial flow, enough to keep the alfalfa from crossing the threshold between stress and loss, enough to last one more week while she found another approach. She worked for 2 hours. The earth at the southern end gave way in sections, and by the time she had cut through to the original creek bed, the water had found the gap and was moving with the quiet urgency of something that has been patient long enough. She stood back and watched the flow establish itself, not the full volume the creek carried at this time of year, but a workable portion, enough to reach the head gate of Dunmore Creek ditch before sunrise if the channel held. She was back in the farmhouse before 4 o'clock. Her boots were caked with creek mud. Her arms ached in the specific way that comes from 2 hours of sustained digging. Pulled the boots off at the door, left them on the step, and went to bed without washing her hands. By 8 o'clock the next morning, a rider from Lander Crossing had delivered a legal notice to her door. The document was from the offices of Pryor and Hatch, attorneys at law, Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, acting on behalf of Fitchland and Cattle Company. It informed Willa Sterne of Dunmore Creek Farm that she had been observed conducting willful destruction of an authorized drainage improvement under Wyoming Territorial Statute 1875, Section 14, and that formal charges would be filed before the Brecken County Circuit Court no later than the 14th of August, with a hearing scheduled for the 10th of September. The possible penalties were listed in plain language: financial damages at the discretion of the court, or confinement not to exceed 60 days. She read the document at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she did not remember making. Toby was at the other end of the table, watching her with the careful stillness of a child who has learned that some information arrives in the expression before it arrives in words. She set the document down flat on the table and pressed both hands against it, as though holding it in place would keep the situation from expanding beyond the boundaries of the page. She had gone to that dam as a woman with a water problem and a failing alfalfa crop and had returned as a defendant. Fitch did not need the charges to result in a conviction. He needed them to exhaust her time, her attention, and whatever money remained after the legal fees accumulated. He had turned her only aggressive action into a legal liability, done it with a speed that confirmed he had anticipated exactly this possibility. For a long moment the kitchen was quiet. Through the window over the sink, the upper alfalfa field was visible, its color not what it should have been in July, not the deep, reliable green but something paler at the edges, a color that meant the overnight flow from her work at the dam had not lasted long enough to matter. The morning after the legal notice arrived, Toby appeared at the kitchen door with mud on his knees and his notebook open to a page he had apparently just written in, the charcoal still fresh enough to smear. He did not hand her the notebook. He set it on the table beside her coffee cup, pointed to the entry at the top of the page, and waited. The entry was not new. He had copied it from an earlier page, a notation from December of 1883 that she had not previously seen. West corner field near old fence post, grass still green. Ground damp under frost, not from the ditch. Ditch ran dry 3 weeks ago in November and this patch stayed wet. Below that, a second notation from March of 1884. Same patch. Cattails now. 2 of them. Ground soft when everything else still frozen. She looked up from the page and found him watching her with the patience of someone who has already arrived at the conclusion and is waiting for the other person to make the walk. There were cattails on the western edge of the Sterne property, in a place where there was no logical source of water. Dunmore Creek ran east to north. The irrigation ditch ran east to south. The west corner field was upslope from the lower pasture and had no connection to either water source by any map or memory she could locate. She had walked past that patch of ground 100 times, registered the green the way one registers familiar things, and filed it under the same category as the way morning light moved across the ridge reel and noted and not yet requiring an explanation. Her grandfather had told her something once, on a summer afternoon, when she was perhaps 7 years old, and following him along the ditch bank while he checked the headgate clearances. He had stopped at a particular section of the bank and crouched to press his palm against the soil, and she had asked him what he was checking for. He had said something she had carried without fully unpacking for 30 years. There's a seam in Greyback, somewhere up where the old stone runs north to south. Your great-uncle and I found the beginning of it, once, before the ditch made it unnecessary. Never followed it all the way through. She had asked what was at the end of it, and he had smiled the way adults smile when a question is better than the answer they have available. Cold water, he had said. The kind that doesn't care what year it is. She closed the notebook carefully and handed it back to her son. They walked to the west corner field together in the mid-morning heat, Toby carrying his notebook and a short-handled spade from the garden shed. The cattails were unmistakable once she was looking at them directly, rather than past them 2 mature plants at the edge of the fence line, and a third smaller one pushing through the soil 6 inches away, all of them growing from ground that was visibly darker than the surrounding earth. She crouched and pressed her palm flat against the soil the way her grandfather had, and felt the coolness come up through the dirt before she felt the dampness. Toby had already begun digging. He was working methodically, not frantically. removing shovelful after shovelful from a line parallel to the fence, deepening the trench with the focused patience of someone who understood that what he was looking for was not going to appear until he had moved enough material to let it. She watched him work for a moment, then went to the tool shed for the heavier spade. 8 inches down, Toby's blade struck something that did not move. Not a rock. She heard the difference in the sound, a flat report rather than the crack of metal hitting stone. He cleared the soil from around the object with the edge of the spade and then with his hands, and what emerged was the surface of cut stone, worked, flat, and laid deliberately. One piece butted against another in a line that ran at a right angle to the fence and directly toward the base of Greyback Ridge. He looked up at her. She was already crouching beside him, her hand on the stone, feeling the temperature that came through it cold enough to tell her something was moving on the other side. Whatever her grandfather had never finished following, whatever great-uncle Elias had found once and left for another season that apparently never came, it was below their hands right now. 35 years after the Dunmore Creek ditch had made it unnecessary to look for it, and it was still doing whatever it had been built to do. She was not certain what that meant yet. She was not certain of anything except that the stone was real, that the cold was real, and that her son had been watching this patch of ground for 7 months and writing it down in a dead man's notebook, because the habit of attention was the only inheritance that cannot be taken from a person and does not require water or weather or luck to produce its return. Agnes Pruitt lived at the north end of Lander Crossing in a house that was smaller than her reputation suggested it should be. She had held the position of county surveyor for 9 years, which was 3 years longer than anyone had expected when the appointment was made, and 6 years longer than Cornelius Fitch's attorney had argued it should continue when he filed an administrative challenge against her reappointment in 1881. The challenge had failed. Agnes had appeared at the hearing with 14 years of field records, a surveying transit older than the territory itself, and the specific composure of a woman who has spent decades reading land that does not negotiate with whoever is standing on it. The challenge was withdrawn before the second session. Willa had not spoken to Agnes in any meaningful way for 11 years. The distance between their families had begun with a dispute over irrigation scheduling that had grown, through the usual accumulation of small slights and unreturned courtesies, into the kind of silence that becomes its own tradition. It was not hatred. It was the particular coldness of people who had once been adjacent and had chosen by degrees to stop being so. Willa was aware, walking up Agnes's front path on the last day of July, that she was asking for help from a woman she had given no reason to extend it. Agnes answered the door before Willa knocked, which meant she had seen her coming up the road. She was shorter than Willa remembered, or perhaps only seemed so in the context of her own doorway, and she held a coffee cup in both hands with the easy authority of someone who does not expect to be surprised by what the morning brings. She looked at Willa for a long moment without speaking, then stepped back from the door. The office Agnes kept in the back of the house was the room of a person who used what they owned. Maps covered 3 of the 4 walls, pinned at the corners and overlapping at the edges, some hand-drawn, some printed, some covered with penciled notations in a hand that Willa recognized after a moment as the same hand that appeared on the survey markers she had passed along the county roads for years without associating them with a person. The surveying transit stood on its tripod in the corner like a piece of furniture. Filing boxes lined the lower shelves in labeled rows, the labels written in ink so old it had turned the color of dried grass. Willa set Toby's notebook on the desk without preamble and opened it to the December entry. She explained what the entries described, where the stones were, and what the temperature of the ground above them had told her. She did not ask for anything yet. She laid the facts in order the way she would have laid tools on a workbench, and waited. Agnes read both entries. She read them again. She set the notebook down and turned to the filing boxes on the lower shelf, running her finger along the labels until she found the one she wanted, marked Original Survey Plats Brecken County 1,847 through 1,851. She lifted the box to the desk, removed the lid, and began working through the contents with the methodical speed of someone who knows exactly what they have filed and roughly where they have filed it. The documents she pulled were large, folded into quarters, the paper thickened at the creases from years of opening and closing. She unfolded the relevant section on the desk surface and weighted the corners with a brass compass, a rock she apparently used as a paperweight, and the coffee cup, which was now empty. The paper was a survey plat drawn in the spring of 1849, hand-drafted with the precision that the instruments of that period permitted, and the personal variation that human hands always introduce, covering the entirety of what was now the Ashevale Flats Valley and the lower western slope of Greyback Ridge. Agnes placed a finger on the line that marked the Dunmore Creek ditch and traced it from the headgate notation to the southern boundary of the Sterne property. Then she moved her finger left-west across the plat to a notation that Willa had not seen on any county map produced in the past 30 years. The notation was small, written in the angular surveyor's hand of the original drafter, and it indicated a secondary channel running perpendicular to the main ditch, originating at a point marked with a symbol Willa did not immediately recognize. Agnes identified it without being asked. It was the notation for constructed intake stone-lined, hand-built, distinct from a natural watercourse. The channel it indicated ran westward from the base of Greyback Ridge at an angle that, if extended across the Sterne property, would place its outlet precisely at the location of the cattails Toby had been recording for 7 months. This was not a branch of Dunmore Creek. It was not downstream from the ditch, and it was not upstream from it. It ran at a right angle to the entire Dunmore system, drawing from a different point on the ridge entirely a spring intake, as the plat notation specified, associated with a water right filing dated the same week as the original homestead claims of 1,849. Agnes's finger did not move from the notation for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had the quality of a person thinking out loud, sorting through implications as they arrived, rather than presenting conclusions she had already reached. If this is what it appears to be, she said, there is a registered water right on this plat that does not appear on the current county maps, which means it was either formally abandoned at some point, and the record of abandonment is somewhere in those boxes, or it was never abandoned, never developed beyond initial construction, and never properly indexed into the revised county records when the territorial maps were updated in 1866. Willa asked which of those was more likely. Agnes considered the question with the deliberateness she gave to any question that had consequences attached to its answer. Given what that boy of yours has been writing down for the past year, she said, I would say the spring is still producing, which would make the right harder to call abandoned. She was quiet again for a moment. Then she went back to the filing box and began looking for something else. Cormac Daly was not easy to find because he was not, at 70 years old, interested in being found by anyone who had not already established a reason worth responding to. He had retired from active contract work 2 years earlier after a fall from a ditch bank that had left him with a knee that predicted weather more reliably than the almanac. He lived 4 miles outside Lander Crossing on a small property he maintained with the residual perfectionism of a man who had spent 4 decades making water move through difficult country and could not stop noticing when things were not properly graded. Agnes knew where he was because she had hired him twice in the past decade for county work that required someone who understood old construction methods, and because Cormac Daly had the kind of institutional knowledge that a surveyor learns to keep track of the way a farmer keeps track of water carefully because it is not replaceable. He arrived at Dunmore Creek Farm on a Tuesday morning in the first week of August, driving his own wagon with his own tools in the bed and his bad knee propped at an angle that suggested he had worked out an accommodation with it over time. He was a large man who had been larger before age, reduced the excess, and left only what was structural, with hands that looked as though they had been made for a different scale of work than most hands were asked to do. He did not introduce himself when he climbed down from the wagon. Agnes had sent a letter ahead, and he appeared to consider that sufficient. He spent the first half of the morning walking the line Agnes had traced on the 1,849 plat, working with a steel probe rod he carried like a walking staff, pressing it into the earth at intervals, and listening to what the resistance told him. Willa walked with him without speaking because he did not appear to be in a conversation. Toby followed at a distance that acknowledged he was observing, rather than participating, his notebook open against his forearm. At the point where the probe rod returned a sound and a resistance that satisfied him, Cormac stopped. He probed the same point from 3 different angles, each time with the same result. Then he probed 6 inches to the left, 6 inches to the right, and confirmed the boundary of whatever was below them. He crouched with the complaint of the knee making itself known in his expression and pressed his palm against the ground, held it there for a count she did not try to measure. He rose carefully. The structure is there, he said, not to anyone in particular, or perhaps to the ground itself. 180 feet at minimum, probably more. The stone is intact, collapsed. Material is blocking flow, but the walls themselves have not failed. Your gate is further in, maybe another 30-40 feet past, where the sediment is heaviest. Willa asked how he could tell the walls were intact. His expression suggested the question was reasonable, even if the answer was self-evident to him. Because if the walls had failed, the ground above them would show it, he said. You'd have settling, cracking, low spots running the length of the tunnel. This ground is flat and consistent all the way to the ridge. Whatever blocked it came from inside, not from collapse. Sediment, root intrusion, rockfall from the upper section where the angle changes any of those. Probably all 3. But the structure is sound. He was looking at the ridge when he said the next part. Whoever built this understood hydraulic head, he said. The intake elevation relative to the outlet, they calculated that by hand with a spirit level and a good eye, and they got it right. Water still wants to travel this line, it's just not finding its exit. The process of locating the original water right filing took 4 days, which was 3 days longer than it should have taken, and 1 day less than Bertram Holloway had warned them to expect. Bertram was 70 years old and had kept the county records since before the territorial reorganization, which meant he had personally overseen 3 separate filing systems and knew where every document in the archive was physically located, including the ones that were not located where they should have been. He found the 1,849 filing on the afternoon of the 4th day, in a drawer labeled with the Halloran family name. The misfiling had occurred in 1851, when a new clerk had encountered a document listing all three founding family names and had made a reasonable but consequential decision to file it under the first name in the alphabetical sequence. Sterne came after Pruitt, and Pruitt came after Halloran. So Halloran it had been for 33 years, while the Sterne and Pruitt families operated under the assumption that the ditch was their only documented water right and the spring intake was something that had been noted and then set aside when the main channel proved sufficient. The filing was explicit. Water right for a constructed spring intake channel. Greyback Ridge, western slope, originating at a natural spring identified as productive year-round. Priority date, April 17, 1849. Registered holders, Elias Sterne, August Pruitt, George Halloran, in equal shares. Intended use irrigation and stock water for homestead parcels as filed. The document bore the original Territorial Water Office seal, faded but legible, and the signatures of all three men in the particular careful script of people who understood they were putting their names on something that would outlast them. No abandonment notice had ever been filed, no formal relinquishment. The right had simply gone unused, then unfound, then forgotten, not legally extinguished, only practically dormant, sitting in a drawer under the wrong name, while the main ditch supplied enough water to make looking for it unnecessary. Bertram held the document under his reading lamp and said, with the precision of a man who chose his words in proportion to the weight of what he was saying, that in his experience, water rights did not disappear simply because no one was using them. They disappeared when someone formally surrendered them or when a court found them abandoned. This one showed no evidence of either. Whether a court would agree was a different question, and one that was above his authority to answer. Dr. Emmeline Voss came from Denver on the 17th of August, arriving on the afternoon stage with a canvas travel bag and a leather case that contained instruments Willa did not have names for. She was lean and precise in her movements, with the focused quality of someone who spent most of her time looking at things other people walked past without noticing. Agnes had written to her 2 weeks earlier, describing the situation in technical terms that Willa had not fully followed but which had apparently communicated everything necessary because Voss arrived with the manner of someone who had already done her preliminary thinking and was ready to test it against the actual ground. She spent the first afternoon at the cattails site, taking samples from the soil at measured intervals and recording measurements she did not explain while she was taking them. She worked until the light failed and then worked a while longer by feel, not seeming to find the darkness inconvenient. In the morning, she went to the ridge with Agnes and Cormac and spent 3 hours on the upper western slope examining the rock formations and the lines of seepage that were visible in certain places if you knew what you were looking at, which Willa did not but was beginning to learn. When Voss came back to the farmhouse that evening, she spread her notes on the kitchen table and explained what they said with the directness of a person who respects the intelligence of her audience, even when the subject is specialized. The geology of Greyback Ridge created what was called a natural head, a pressure differential produced by elevation and the specific angle at which the rock layers trapped and channeled snowmelt. Water entering the ridge from above was held in the stone for months and released slowly through the spring, which was why the spring produced water year-round even in dry summers, and why the flow was coldest in August rather than in March, when you would expect it if the source were simple surface runoff. The critical point, Voss said, was that this system operated entirely independently of Dunmore Creek. They shared the same ridge as their origin but drew from different formations at different elevations. Fitch's dam on the creek could not reduce the spring output by a single gallon. The spring did not care about the dam did not know the spring existed. What existed in the ground beneath the Sterne property's western corner was not an amenity. It was a separate water source with its own pressure, its own flow rate, its own prior appropriation date, and its own documented legal right if that right was still valid, which was not her determination to make, but which the geological evidence suggested had never been physically interrupted. She said one other thing before she closed her notes, looking across the kitchen table at Willa with the directness of a scientist who has reached a conclusion and sees no reason to soften it. The people who built that intake channel in 1849, she said, understood this ridge better than most engineers I've worked alongside. They didn't force the water. They read the ground and let the ground do the work. That's not luck. That's knowledge applied carefully over time. Harlan Coe maintained his practice out of a single-room office on a side street in Cheyenne that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper and the specific industry of a man who had been keeping his own files for 20 years without assistance. He was 45, with a precise legal mind that he applied with equal discipline to straightforward cases and to the complicated ones that other attorneys in the territory preferred not to touch, not because they were unwinnable, but because they required a depth of research that was not recoverable in a standard fee arrangement. Agnes had recommended him specifically because he had argued 2 prior appropriation cases before the Territorial Water Court in the past decade and had won both. She had written to him on the same day she wrote to Voss, and he had written back within the week with a list of questions that demonstrated he had already identified the central legal vulnerabilities before he had seen a single document. Willa rode the stage to Cheyenne on the 22nd of August, carrying the original survey plat Agnes had lent her, a copy of Toby's notebook entries she had made herself at the kitchen table the night before, and Bertram's certified copy of the 1,849 water right filing. She had left Toby with Ruth Cavendish for the day, which he had accepted without objection in the manner of a child who understood that some of his mother's business required her to be somewhere he could not follow. Co read everything she brought in the order she had assembled it, and did not speak for nearly 20 minutes, which she had not expected and which told her something about the quality of his attention. When he finished, he set the documents in a different order than she had arranged them, the water right filing on top, the plat second, Toby's entries third, and explained his reasoning. Under the doctrine of prior appropriation as Wyoming Territory had adopted and applied it, the earliest valid right to a given water source had first claim on that source in times of shortage. The 1,849 filing, if valid and not abandoned, predated every water right filed in Brecken County by at least a decade, including the county authorization that underpinned Fitch's dam and his entire drainage scheme. A court that accepted the filing as valid could not simultaneously accept that Fitch's permit superseded it. The permit would be subordinate. Worse, from Fitch's position, a permit granted without disclosure of a pre-existing superior right could be challenged as improperly issued. The complication Co. said was abandonment. Fitch's attorneys would argue that 35 years of non-use constituted practical abandonment regardless of whether a formal relinquishment had been filed. Wyoming Territory had not yet codified a fixed non-use period for abandonment, which meant the question would turn on evidence of intent and on whether any continuous use, however minimal, could be demonstrated. He looked at the notebook entries. He read the December notation and the March notation again separately. Your son, he said, has been documenting continuous flow through the outlet end of that channel for the better part of a year. That is not minimal. That is a documented, dated, witnessed record of ongoing water movement from a source that the right covers. If Fitch argues abandonment, we argue that the channel has been producing evidence of active flow for at least as long as his dam has been blocking the creek, and we have the written record to support it. A boy keeping a notebook because his father kept one is not sophisticated legal strategy. That is exactly why it will work. Then he told her the harder part. She was, as she already knew, a defendant in a criminal action scheduled for hearing on the 10th of September before the Brecken County Circuit Court, which was 7 weeks away. He could handle her defense on that matter and believed the charges would fail. Her actions had occurred on land over which she held a superior water right, which significantly changed the legal character of what she had done. But he needed the water right confirmed before that argument would hold, which meant filing a parallel action immediately, before September 10th, to put the prior appropriation question before court at the same time as the criminal charge. Willa asked what that would cost. Co looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who is calculating something that is not money. He told her he would take the matter on deferred fee, payable after resolution, with no obligation if the action failed. Cases like this one, he said, did not come through his office often, and he had gotten into water law for reasons that had not changed in 20 years. The parallel filing went in on the 28th of August. It named the 1,849 water right as prior and superior to the June 1,884 county permit, and requested that the court order the drainage permit suspended pending determination of its validity. It also named as evidence the geological assessment of Dr. Voss, the certified copy of the original filing, and the survey documentation Agnes had prepared from the 1,849 plat. Fitch's response arrived within 4 days, which was faster than the Territorial Postal Service normally permitted, and suggested his attorneys had been monitoring the situation closely. The response filed 2 arguments simultaneously. First, that 35 years of non-use constituted abandonment under any reasonable interpretation of territorial precedent. Second, that the spring intake structure was in a state of complete physical disrepair that rendered the right inoperative regardless of its legal status. The second argument surprised Co. because it suggested Fitch's legal team had information about the physical state of the tunnel that they should not have had unless someone had inspected it, which meant someone had been on the western section of the Sterne property without authorization at some point during the dispute. That same week, on the 20th of August, the news reached Willa through Ruth Cavendish, who had heard it from her son at the feed store. The Halloran family had sold their remaining parcel, the last piece of land they held in Brecken County, to Fitch Land and Cattle Company. The sale had closed 2 days earlier. The price had been substantially above what the land was worth by any standard measure. The sale agreement, which Co. obtained a summary of through the county recorder's office, contained a clause in which the Halloran family released any and all claims to historical water rights associated with the Dunmore Creek system and the Brecken County plats of 1,849. Co. explained what this meant with the directness she had come to expect from him. The Halloran share of the 1,849 water right could not be transferred to Fitch through a land sale. Water rights, under prior appropriation doctrine, were appurtenant to the original use, not freely transferable as independent assets the way land was. What the clause accomplished was eliminating the Halloran family as a potential confirming witness to the right's validity and historical exercise. Two of the three original right holders were now effectively removed from the picture. One family's share held by a woman trying to establish the right in court, one family's share in the hands of a man actively opposing it, and the third family's records either supportive or not, depending on what Agnes Pruett's documentation showed when examined carefully. Agnes's documentation showed everything it needed to show. She had over 9 years of county surveying work, accumulated field notes that included multiple references to the western section of the Sterne property, including one notation from a boundary survey she had conducted in 1877 that mentioned in passing the presence of a spring-fed wet area at the west corner fence line, consistent with subsurface water movement from the ridge. She had not, at the time, connected it to the 1,849 plat notation. She connected it now, in a formal affidavit she prepared and signed in Bertram's presence, submitted to Co. for inclusion in the court filing. The criminal hearing on September 10th proceeded at the Brecken County Courthouse in Lander Crossing, in a room that was built for 20 people and contained closer to 60. Word had moved through the valley in the way that word moves when a legal action touches something that other people understand could touch them next. Farmers from 3 adjacent valleys were in the gallery alongside the usual presence of anyone in a county seat who finds the courthouse more interesting than what they had originally planned for the morning. Cornelius Fitch sat in the front row on the respondent's side with 2 attorneys, both from the Cheyenne firm, and the specific stillness of a man who believes the architecture of the situation favors him and is waiting for the building to do its work. He did not look at Willa when she entered. She had learned to understand a technique rather than an oversight. Judge Luther Gaines was 60, deliberate, and had the appearance of a man who had presided over enough contested matters in 20 years of circuit work to be unimpressed by the quality of anyone's documentation until he had read it himself. He read everything submitted to him before either attorney spoke a word, which took 12 minutes and produced a silence in the courtroom that was different from impatience. It was the silence of people watching a person who holds authority actually use it. Fitch's lead attorney argued the criminal matter first: willful destruction of a county-authorized improvement, violation of Territorial Statute 1,875 Section 14, damages to be assessed at replacement cost plus delay costs to the Fitch Highland grazing allotment. The argument was competent and moved quickly through its points, concluding with the position that the defendant's personal grievance about water access did not entitle her to destroy legally permitted infrastructure. Coe did not argue the criminal matter as a separate question. He argued it as a consequence of the water right question. A property holder acting to restore access to water covered by a valid prior appropriation right was not committing destruction of permitted infrastructure. She was exercising a right that predated the permit by 35 years, and that the permit's issuance could not legally override. To determine whether a crime had occurred, he told the court first had to determine whether the permit itself was valid, given what the record now showed about the pre-existing right. Judge Gaines asked 3 questions. He asked when the permit had been issued. He asked when the 1,849 water right filing had been made. He asked whether Brecken County had performed any search of prior water right filings before issuing the June 1,884 permit. The county commissioner's office had no representative present to answer the 3rd question. Tech was not in the room. Fitch's attorneys answered that the permit process did not require such a search, which was technically accurate and visibly did not satisfy the judge. Gaines announced that he was deferring ruling on both the criminal matter and the parallel water right action pending a site inspection, which he would conduct personally, accompanied by the county surveyor. He would hear final arguments after the inspection and issue a ruling at a date to be set. He set the site inspection for the following Tuesday. The decision produced 2 distinct reactions in the courtroom. On Willa's side, a controlled relief, not victory, but the removal of immediate defeat. On Fitch's side, a recalibration. He left the room without speaking to either of his attorneys, which Willa noted because it was the first time she had seen him visibly surprised. She walked out of the courthouse into the September afternoon, with Harlan Coe beside her, and found Cormac Daly waiting on the steps, his bad knee resting against the bottom post, his hat in his hand. He had not been in the courtroom. He had apparently not needed to be. He told her the excavation permit application should go in before the end of the week. The judge would want to see the tunnel's condition during the site visit, and seeing it half cleared was more persuasive than seeing it unexamined. He had already spoken to Agnes about the supervision requirements and had located 2 men he trusted to work the outer section while he managed the approach. He told her one other thing, standing on the courthouse steps in the last of the afternoon sun. Whatever a court decided about paper rights and permit dates, he said, the real question was whether the water was still there, and the water was still there. He had pressed his hand against that ground and felt it. Courts could be appealed. Water that was still in the ground was simply a fact. Willa looked at him for a moment, this large, deliberate man who had spent 40 years making water go where it was supposed to go, and had not stopped thinking about it since. "You're going to clear it regardless of what the judge decides," she said. He put his hat back on. "I'm going to clear it because that's what needs doing," he said. "What the judge decides is a separate matter." The excavation permit was filed on Friday. It was approved the following Monday, the day before the site inspection, with Agnes Pruitt listed as supervising authority. The speed of approval suggested that somewhere in the county administrative process, Judge Gaines's pending site visit had communicated a priority that the commission had not required Willa to articulate directly. The work began at first light on Wednesday, the morning after Gaines completed his site inspection, and before anyone had received official word of what the inspection had produced. Cormac's two men, a young worker named Lund and an older man named Cabot, who had worked irrigation contracts across 3 territories, began at the outer section with round-pointed shovels, methodically removing the decades of sediment that had accumulated against the stone facing where the tunnel met the open air. The stone was in the condition Cormac had predicted, intact, mortared with a lime compound that had hardened to near stone itself over 35 years. The individual blocks fitted with the close tolerance of someone who had understood that water would find any gap and exploit it. Toby was there from the start, which Willa had permitted, because the alternative was leaving him at the Cavendish farm again, and because the work was not dangerous and he understood more about what was being uncovered than anyone had taught him. He worked at the sections where the passage narrowed, not the deep blocked interior, which required Cabot's experience and Cormac's direction, but the outer approach where root material and compacted soil had narrowed the effective opening. He moved material with the short-handled spade and passed filled buckets back to the outside without being asked twice about anything. On the 4th day, when the deeper work reached the transition point where the sediment gave way to rockfall from what appeared to have been a minor collapse near the spring head, Cormac stopped the excavation and walked the outer section himself, checking the walls and the mortar and the overhead stone at intervals. When he finished, he said the structure was holding. The collapse had been superficial, a single large stone that had shifted and brought smaller material down with it, blocking the channel without damaging the walls behind it. 2 more days would clear it. On the 6th day, Lund came out of the passage carrying a piece of cut stone that was different from the channel material, smoother, worked on all faces, with a shallow groove along one edge. Cormac examined it and identified it without consulting anyone. It was a component of the original sluice gate mechanism, displaced by the rockfall that had caused the blockage, which meant the gate itself was further in and, given the condition of the material around it, almost certainly still intact. He was right. On the 7th day, at a depth of approximately 160 feet from the open face, they found the gate. It was a vertical stone slab, fitted into channels cut into the tunnel walls on either side, with a timber lifting mechanism that had partially deteriorated but retained enough structural integrity to show its original function. The stone itself had not moved. In 35 years of blockage behind it and pressure in front of it, the gate had remained in its closed position, not because it was locked, but because the accumulated material on the downstream side had held it in place with the passive authority of neglect. Cormac spent an hour clearing the material from the immediate area of the gate and examining the mechanism before he was willing to say anything. When he was ready, he came out and found Willa sitting on the stone facing of the tunnel entrance with her back against the ridge, watching the sun move across the valley below. "The gate's intact," he said. "The lifting mechanism needs rebuilding. The timber's gone, but the stone is sound. We can fabricate a new mechanism in 2 days, and it'll work the same way it worked in 1849. A person standing here can open or close the flow by hand, no equipment required." She asked him what the original builders had understood to produce something that lasted this long. He considered it the way he considered anything mechanical from the inside out. "They understood that stone doesn't rot and water doesn't change," he said. "They weren't building for 10 years or 20. They built for as long as the ridge held water, which is to say they built for longer than anyone was going to be around to argue about it. Every joint, every grade, every fitted surface, they were thinking past themselves. That's a kind of patience that doesn't get taught anymore because most people don't believe they'll need it." Toby had come out of the passage behind Cormac and was standing at the edge of the work area, his notebook open, the charcoal moving. He was recording the gate dimensions, the stone's approximate measurements, the wall channel depth, the mechanism position. He was making a record of something he had not seen built and would not see destroyed, on the same principle that had produced the original builder's careful joints and level grades. Willa looked at her son standing in the entrance of a tunnel his great-great-grandfather had cut into a Wyoming ridge 35 years before she was born, writing down what he saw because it seemed to him like information worth keeping, and she felt something that was not sentiment and not pride and not grief, though it contained elements of all three. It was closer to recognition, the particular feeling of seeing something you already knew confirmed in a form you had not expected. The new lifting mechanism took 2 days to fabricate and install. Built from seasoned oak that Cormac sourced from the Lander Crossing lumber yard at his own expense, shaped to the same dimensions as the original timbers using the degraded wood as a template. When the mechanism was fitted, Cormac tested the stone's travel in its wall channels 3 times before he was satisfied, lifting it by hand to confirm the grade and clearance, then lowering it again until the tunnel was fully sealed. On the morning of the 9th day, before the mechanism had been opened for the first time, a rider arrived from Lander Crossing with a message from Harlan Co. The judge had ruled on the site inspection findings. The ruling was a single page, written in the restrained judicial language that said everything necessary in the fewest words the law permitted. Judge Gaines had found the 1,849 water right filing valid, continuous, and unabandoned. He had found the June 1,884 county permit improperly issued on the grounds that the permitting process had not identified the pre-existing prior right. He had ordered the criminal charges against Willa Sterne dismissed. He had further ordered a public hearing on the drainage permit status to be scheduled within 30 days. Coe's letter, appended below the judge's summary, contained one additional sentence. The parallel filing has put the prior appropriation question in front of the water court and the permit question in front of the county commission simultaneously. Fitch's attorneys will need to answer both at once. Willa folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. She walked to where Cormac was standing at the tunnel entrance, waiting with his hand on the lifting mechanism. She put her hand beside his on the timber. He looked at her. She lifted. Water does not announce itself. It does not rush or celebrate or make any concession to the years it has spent waiting. It simply moves, the way it has always moved, along the line of least resistance, filling what is below it before it reaches for what is beyond. When Willa and Cormac lifted the gate together, the stone rising in its channels with a smoothness that neither of them had been certain to expect, what came through was not a surge. It was a presence, a column of cold moving through the dark of the tunnel, finding the channel it had been cut to follow, beginning its descent toward the valley with the unhurried intention of something that has no doubt about where it is going. Toby was at the outlet, at the edge of the cattail patch when the water reached him. He had walked down from the tunnel entrance 20 minutes earlier without being asked to, carrying his notebook, and had taken up a position that was not quite sitting and not quite crouching, his weight on one knee, his free hand pressed against the soil near the base of the largest cattail. He felt the temperature change before the water surfaced, a coolness spreading through the earth ahead of the flow, the way cold air moves under a closed door before the door opens. When the water finally appeared at the outlet, pushing through a seam in the stone facing that Cormac had cleared on the 7th day, it moved across Toby's fingers without ceremony. He did not pull his hand back. He held it there, feeling the temperature and the pressure and the specific quality of water that has traveled through rock for longer than anyone present had been alive. He did not say anything. He opened his notebook and wrote the date. Cormac came down from the tunnel entrance 15 minutes later, moving at the pace his knee permitted on the slope, and found Tope still at the outlet and Willa standing 6 feet back watching the flow establish itself in the old channel bed. The water was moving with increasing confidence as the accumulated sediment in the lower section shifted and settled to accommodate it. It was not the volume of Dunmore Creek. It was not intended to be. It was what a spring produces when it is given a clear path, steady, cold, reliable, entirely indifferent to the events of the past 3 months. Cormac crouched beside the outlet and let the water run across his palm. He held it there for a moment before he spoke. Your grandfather and 2 other men dug the intake channel and fitted this stone, he said, not to Toby specifically, not to Willa, but to the space between them. They had nothing but hand tools, a spirit level they probably borrowed, and a fundamental understanding of how much a given surface needs to drop per foot to keep water in motion without machinery to push it. They built it once correctly and then walked away from it because they didn't need it anymore. And here it still is. Toby asked, with the directness that was his way, whether it could be blocked again. Only 2 ways, Cormac told him. Someone deliberately closes it, or the spring itself fails. Springs like this one, fed by snowmelt working through fractured granite over decades before it ever reaches the surface, those don't fail on a human timeline. The mountain would have to change. The mountain above them in the late September light showed no sign of intending to change. The public hearing on Fitch's drainage permit was scheduled for the 2nd week of October, giving the county commission 30 days from Judge Gaines's ruling to convene the proceeding he had ordered. In the intervening weeks, 3 things happened in a sequence that was not coincidental, but that no single person had engineered, which made each development more consequential than a planned strategy would have been. The first was that Harlan Co., reviewing the chain of title documents for the parcels Fitch had purchased along the ridge over the past 2 years, found the clause. It was not hidden. It was in the standard location for such language. In the title exceptions section of each purchase agreement, and in each case it read in substantially the same terms, excluding any unresolved prior water claims of record in Brecken County. The phrase had appeared in all 3 purchase agreements Fitch had executed for the ridge parcels. It was the kind of language that appears when a buyer's attorney has identified a potential encumbrance and wants to ensure that the buyer is not acquiring the liability associated with it which meant that before Fitch had driven the first post of his grazing allotment boundary, before he had filed for the drainage permit, before he had made his first offer to Willa, his own legal team had found the 1,849 filing and had priced the risk of its validity into their transaction structure without disclosing that risk to the county commissioner, who subsequently issued the permit. Coe wrote to Willa with a restraint that communicated exactly as much as it needed to. The language in these agreements is not accidental, he wrote. A drafter includes that clause when they have identified something specific to exclude. The question the Commission will need to answer is whether a permit applicant who has contractually acknowledged the potential existence of a prior water claim is obligated to disclose that acknowledgement to the permitting authority. I believe the answer is yes. I believe the Commission will find the answer is yes. I believe Fitch's attorneys know this, which is why they filed for the permit in June and moved the construction timeline as quickly as they did. The second thing that happened was that the Wyoming Territorial Gazette published a piece about the Brecken County water dispute on its front page, not because any party to the litigation had spoken to the paper, but because the Gazette's correspondent in Lander Crossing had attended the September 10th hearing and had understood what he was watching. The piece was factual and dry in the way that territorial newspaper coverage generally was, citing documents and hearing dates and the names of the parties. What it communicated in the arrangement of those facts was that a widow operating a farm on a water right older than the territory itself had been cut off from her water supply by a development concern whose own purchase documents suggested prior knowledge of the right they were circumventing. The piece ran on a Thursday. By the following Monday, Coe had received inquiries from 2 other attorneys in Cheyenne who had clients with adjacent or downstream water rights and wanted to understand the implications of what the Brecken County case might establish. The third development was the arrival at the Sterne farm on a Tuesday morning in late September of a man Willa did not recognize, driving a wagon that was better maintained than most, wearing clothes that were clean and pressed in a way that said he had come from somewhere with a laundry. He introduced himself as the son-in-law of August Pruitt, Agnes's uncle, the second of the 3 original homestead families. He had seen the Gazette piece and had ridden 2 days from his own property to the north to understand what it meant for his family's share of the 1,849 right, because he had not known the right existed until he read about it in a newspaper. And because, if it was real, he had 30 years of his family's irrigation history that he wished he had known to document. His name was Everett Marsh. He was Agnes Pruitt's cousin by marriage, which made his arrival at the farm an accidental convergence of the dispute's various threads that no one had planned but that Coe, when Willa wrote to him about it, said was exactly the kind of development that cases like this one needed. He arranged to meet Marsh at the courthouse records office the following week. The October hearing convened at 9 in the morning in a room the Commission had moved to the largest available space in Lander Crossing, which was the meeting hall above the feed store, because the courthouse room had proved insufficient at the September proceeding. The hall held 90 people. It held more than 90 on the day of the hearing, with the additional attendees standing along the walls and in the doorway propped open to manage the temperature. 3 of the 5 county commissioners were seated at the front table. The other 2 had sent written notices of conflict of interest and recused themselves, which told its own story about the reach of Fitch's influence in the county structure. Agnes Pruitt sat at the table designated for supporting witnesses, with her original survey plats weighted flat in front of her. Bertram Holloway sat beside her, his certified copy of the 1,849 filing in a folder wrapped in oilcloth against the weather. Dr. Voss had sent a written geological assessment, notarized and submitted to the Commission 10 days earlier, because her professional obligations had prevented her return from Denver. Cormac Day sat in the front row of the gallery with his hat on his knee, present as a witness to the physical excavation. Fitch's legal team numbered 3 this time. The lead attorney was a man named Whitmore, who had not appeared at the September hearing and whose manner communicated that he was accustomed to appearing when initial proceedings had not gone as intended. He was composed, methodical, and spoke with the particular confidence of a lawyer who has reviewed the case documents and identified the argument he intends to make before he enters the room. Whitmore made that argument first. The 1,849 filing was a historical document with no connection to present-day water use. The spring intake had been effectively dormant for 3.5 decades. Geological assessments and survey plats could not convert an obsolete document into an operative water right. The county commission had every authority to issue drainage permits for legitimate agricultural development, and the Fitch Highland grazing allotment represented exactly the kind of productive land use that Wyoming Territory's development required. Prior appropriation doctrine, properly applied, required continuous beneficial use, not a few entries in a child's notebook. He did not look at Toby when he said this. Toby was sitting in the gallery beside Ruth Cavendish and was writing in his notebook with the focused composure of a person who has not been addressed directly, even when the reference is clear. Coe let the argument finish before he stood. He placed 4 documents on the table in front of the commission: the 1,849 water right filing, the certified chain of title for Fitch's 3 ridge parcel purchases, Agnes's survey documentation including the 1,877 field notation, and a single page he set apart from the others. He began with the chain of title. He read the relevant clause from each purchase agreement aloud. He did not editorialize. He read the words as written, 3 times, one for each document, and let the room absorb what they said. The commission chairman asked him to read the clause from the second agreement again. He did. The single page he had set apart was a letter, not a legal document, not testimony, not a filed exhibit in any prior proceeding. It was a letter written by the original clerk who had misfiled the 1,849 water right under the Halloran name in 1,851, discovered by Bertram in the same drawer as the original filing. The clerk had apparently written it as a note to himself explaining the filing decision. The letter said, in the plain language of a man keeping his own record straight, that the water right document listed 3 family names, and he had filed it under the first alphabetically, as was his practice with joint documents, Halloran being first, and that it pertained to a spring intake on the western Greyback face belonging in equal shares to the 3 families listed and registered the same week as their original land claims. Clerk had understood what he was filing. He had noted what it was. He had simply placed it in the wrong location, and 33 years had passed without anyone finding it. Bertram confirmed, when the commission asked, that the letter was in the same hand as other records from that clerk's period, that it was consistent with the ink and paper of 1,851, and that he had found it folded inside the water right document itself, as though the clerk had placed it there as a future reference that was never consulted. Whitmore objected on the grounds that the letter was not a legal instrument. Coe agreed that it was not. It was, he said, evidence of intent and of the document's content at the time of filing, which was relevant to the question of whether the right had ever been properly indexed and whether the lack of indexing could be used to argue abandonment. A right lost to administrative error was not the same as a right abandoned by choice. The commission heard from Agnes on the survey documentation, from Everett Marsh on his family's historical knowledge of the spring, and from Willa on the farm's water history and the discovery of the tunnel. They heard from Whitmore at length on the question of beneficial use and the standards for abandonment under territorial precedent. The hearing lasted 4 hours. The commission recessed without ruling. 3 days after the hearing, Coe received a communication from Whitmore's office that was not a legal filing and was not addressed to the court. It was a letter, delivered by messenger, proposing a negotiated settlement of the permit dispute. The terms Whitmore proposed required Willa to agree that the 1,849 water right would be satisfied by a guaranteed minimum flow from Fitch's revised drainage plan, in exchange for which Fitch would withdraw all remaining legal claims, restore the Dunmore Creek channel, and make a payment to the Sterne property described as compensation for the interruption of water service. Coe forwarded the letter to Willa, with a single handwritten note in the margin. This is not an offer made from strength. She read it at the kitchen table on a Friday evening, with the lamp lit and the sound of the autumn wind moving against the house, and she understood what it meant before she finished the first paragraph. Fitch was not offering a settlement because the commission was likely to rule in her favor. He was offering it because a commission ruling in her favor would establish something on the public record that he could not undo with a later legal action, a formal finding that his permit had been issued on the basis of information he had an obligation to provide and had withheld. That finding would follow his name into every subsequent land or water transaction in Wyoming territory. She wrote back through Coe the following Monday. She declined the settlement. She asked the commission to rule on the record as submitted. The commission issued its ruling on the 28th of October, 1884. It was a document of 11 pages that worked through the legal questions in sequence, citing territorial statute and prior precedent at each step, reaching its conclusions in the final 3 pages with the deliberateness of a body that understood the implications of what it was putting on paper. The 1,849 water right was found valid, continuous, and unabandoned. The commission accepted the geological evidence that the spring had produced water through the channel's outlet without interruption. The administrative misfiling constituted a clerical error and not a legal relinquishment, and the documented entries in the field notebook it named Tobias Sterne, specifically, as the recorder constituted contemporaneous evidence of ongoing water movement from the rights-covered source. The June 1,884 drainage permit was found improperly issued. The commission found that an applicant for a drainage permit affecting a watercourse in Brecken County was required by existing territorial statute to disclose known prior claims on that watercourse, and that the language in Fitch's own purchase agreements demonstrated that his legal team had identified the potential existence of the 1,849 right before the permit application was filed. The permit was rescinded. Fitch was ordered to remove the dam and restore the natural course of Dunmore Creek within 30 days at his own expense. He was further ordered to redesign the drainage plan for the Fitch Highland grazing allotment to accommodate rather than supersede the 1,849 water, right in both its spring intake form and its Dunmore Creek headgate expression. The redesign obligation was the part that mattered most to Fitch's actual plans, and the commission had been precise about it. The allotment's drainage infrastructure would need to be rebuilt around a water right it could not redirect, which required moving the entire eastern boundary of the proposed development, relocating the timber pipe infrastructure, and accepting a substantially smaller effective grazing area than the allotment had been designed around. Cost of this became public through the Gazette's subsequent coverage and ran to more than twice the total of all three offers Fitch had made to purchase Dunmore Creek Farm. He did not contest the ruling in court. Coe had told Willa that he might, and she had spent a week preparing herself for the possibility of another round of proceedings. What happened instead was that Whitmore filed a notice of compliance on Fitch's behalf 3 weeks after the ruling, stating that the removal of the dam would be completed by the deadline and that engineering work on the revised drainage plan had commenced. The notice contained no admission of wrongdoing and no direct acknowledgement of what the ruling's findings implied about the conduct of his legal team. It was the document of a man who had decided that forward motion was preferable to additional exposure. A week after the compliance notice, word came through Harlan Coe that the Wyoming Territorial Legislature's Committee on Land and Water Affairs had opened an inquiry into the permitting process in Brecken County, prompted by correspondence from 3 members who had read the Gazette coverage. Coe said this was not something Willa had requested or needed to manage. It was a consequence of what the record showed, and the record would speak for itself. What Coe did not include in his letter, but that Willa learned from Agnes in November, was that Cornelius Fitch had withdrawn his name from consideration for the territorial council seat he had been expected to pursue in the 1,885 elections. He had made no public statement about the withdrawal. His attorney had communicated it to the party committee by letter, citing unspecified business commitments. The seat had been the real ambition behind 2 years of land acquisition and county relationship building. The infrastructure projects and the road funding and the careful cultivation of every official whose signature he might eventually need. Without the council seat, the Fitch Highland grazing allotment was a failed real estate venture, with a remediation order attached to it. With it, it would have been the foundation of something larger. He had built the foundation first and lost the building before he could lay the walls. Agnes told Willa this on a November afternoon at the Pruitt property, where they had met to sign the revised maintenance agreement for the spring intake channel. The agreement was 3 pages, drafted by Coe at cost and notarized by Bertram, naming the Sterne and Pruitt families as the active co-holders of the 1,849 water right. Everett Marsh had signed a separate acknowledgement of his family's historical share, but had indicated he did not intend to assert a current water claim on his own land, given that his property drew from a different water source. The document included a maintenance rotation, a protocol for gate adjustments by season, and a clause specifying that any future transfer of the right required the written consent of both active families. Agnes signed first, then Willa. The pen was the same one Agnes used for official county business, a fact that did not need to be observed aloud. Coe waived the remainder of his fee the following week. His letter explained this in 2 sentences. He had accepted the case on the terms he had offered, and those terms included the condition that resolution of the parallel water right action in the client's favor constituted sufficient satisfaction. He closed by saying that he expected the Commission's findings to have implications for how drainage permits were processed throughout Wyoming territory, which was, in his view, appropriate. The dam came down on the 18th of November, 14 days before Fitch's compliance deadline. Willa was not present for the removal. She was at the farm, finishing the last of the autumn work before the first hard freeze, and she had decided that she did not need to watch. Ruth Cavendish's son Orrin, who had been present, described the work to her the following morning: a team of 6 men with horses and a day's labor, the packed earth breaking apart under the animal force, the timber pipe lifted free of the creek bed and stacked on the bank, the creek finding its original channel with the practical patience that water applies to any opening it is offered. By evening, the flow had re-established itself at the headgate of Dunmore Creek Ditch. By morning, the mud in the lower channel bed had softened and the first trickle was moving toward the alfalfa fields, not yet substantial but present, moving in the direction it was always supposed to move. Willa walked the ditch at 4 in the morning the way she had on the mornings she found it dry, with no lamp because the habit of the path did not require one. The water was running low, not yet at seasonal volume, but real and cold and measurable in the dark by sound. She did not crouch beside it or press her hand into the mud. She simply stood for a moment at the headgate and listened, confirming what she already knew, then walked back to the house. She found Toby awake at the kitchen table. He had the notebook open to a new page, the charcoal in his hand. She sat down across from him and poured coffee from the pot he had apparently already made, and for a while neither of them found it necessary to say anything. Outside, the November wind had the particular quality of a Wyoming winter, introducing itself not hostile, simply present, the way serious things tend to announce themselves. He was recording the date and a notation about the ditch. She read it upside down across the table without meaning to. Water running at headgate. November 19, 1884. Not full volume yet. 3 stitches of charcoal that said exactly as much as needed saying. The alfalfa had been cut and stored before the commission ruling came down, which meant the season was effectively intact despite everything. The final cutting had yielded within 3% of Willa's projections from the previous December, accounting for the stress period during the summer drought. The cattle were in winter condition. The bank payment for the 4th quarter had gone out on time. The first payment in 2 years she had made, without performing the mental arithmetic of what she could sell if it came to that. Cormac came back in late November to inspect the gate mechanism before winter set in. He pronounced the oak installation sound, adjusted the fit in the stone channels with a wood file, and tested the lift 3 times before he was satisfied. He told Willa the timber would last 10 years minimum if she kept the mechanism dry between seasons, which she could do with a simple cover arrangement he showed her how to build from scrap lumber in an afternoon. He stayed for the midday meal, which was the first time he had been inside the farmhouse. He sat across from Toby and they spoke briefly about the gate mechanism and at somewhat more length about the geology of the ridge and what different layers of stone told you about the water they were likely to hold. Toby asked questions that were specific and patient, the kind that suggested he was building toward an understanding rather than collecting isolated facts. Cormac answered in the same mode, not simplifying, treating the questions as the serious instruments of inquiry they were. When Cormac left, Toby went to the west cornfield despite the cold. He went the way he always went, not prompted, not announced, just present at the door, and then moving across the November grass toward the cattails with his notebook under his arm. Willa watched him from the kitchen window while she cleared the dishes. The cattails at the edge of the channel outlet were still standing, brown now and winter-dried, their heads broken open by the wind to release whatever they carried. The ground beneath them was dark with moisture even in November. The water from the spring intake was moving through the outlet and into the lower pasture drainage, small but steady, doing what it had been built to allow. Toby stood at the edge of the outlet for a few minutes, his notebook open but the charcoal still in his coat pocket. He was watching the water, which did not require documentation because it was simply behaving the way water behaves when nothing is blocking it. After a while he closed the notebook and turned back toward the house, not hurrying, walking the way a person walks when returning from something they have checked and found to be as it should be. The winter settled over Asheville Flats with the practicality of a season that has work to do and no interest in being dramatic about it. Snow came in the first week of December and stayed, the way Wyoming snow stays, not melting between storms but accumulating in layers that recorded the winter's chronology in depth rather than width. The ridge above the farm disappeared into cloud for weeks at a time, and then reappeared on clear mornings with more white on it than before. The snowpack building toward the volume that would feed the springs and the creeks and the ditches of the valley through the following summer. Willa kept the maintenance rotation she and Agnes had established, which meant a monthly check of the gate mechanism through the winter and a joint inspection with Agnes in March before the snowmelt began in earnest. The first joint inspection was not warm and was not long. 2 women in heavy coats walking a section of tunnel entrance in the early March wind, confirming that the stone was holding, that the mechanism moved freely, that the outlet at the west corner showed appropriate moisture levels. They spent perhaps 20 minutes at the site and walked back to their respective properties without the ceremony that the occasion might, in other circumstances, have warranted. This was, Willa had come to understand, how things that were meant to last actually lasted not through commemoration, but through the application of regular attention by people who understood what they were maintaining and why it mattered. She filed the corrected water right documentation with the Territorial Office in Cheyenne in March of 1885, as Co had advised, updating the registry to reflect both active family holders and the correct physical description of the spring intake. The filing was indexed under Sterne and Pruitt jointly, with a cross-reference to the original 1849 document number, and a notation that the previous misfiling under the Halloran name had been corrected by commission order. Bertram had sent the same correction to the county archive. Agnes had updated the survey records. The right was now where it had always belonged, properly named, properly located, and attached to a physical water source that had not stopped flowing through any of the years it sat in the wrong drawer. The revised Fitch Highland Grazing Allotment Drainage Plan was submitted to the County Commission in February and approved in a modified form in April. The approved version reduced the allotment's eastern boundary by a quarter mile, relocated the water infrastructure entirely to the northern section of Fitch's Ridge parcels, and contained no element that touched Dunmore Creek or the Greyback Spring system. The engineering review that accompanied the submission noted, without editorializing, that the original drainage plan had been designed, without accounting for existing water rights in the affected area, and that the revised plan had been structured to ensure no such oversight recurred. Fitch did not appear at the April commission session. His attorney filed the submission and responded to the commission's questions in writing. The allotment, as approved, was smaller than what Fitch had planned and would require several additional years of development before it could operate at the scale he had originally projected. He had not made any further land purchases in Brecken County. He had not been seen in Lander Crossing since the October hearing. What he had lost in the end was not recoverable through redesign or revised projections. The Territorial Council inquiry had resulted in new procedural requirements for drainage permit applications throughout Wyoming Territory, effective in 1885, requiring applicants to submit a certified title search covering prior water claims before a permit could be issued. The rule had Fitch's case as its originating circumstance, a fact noted in the Commission's official record without sentiment. His name was attached to a procedural reform that had been made necessary by his own conduct, which was the kind of legacy that follows a person through a territory's records long after the specific events that produced it have stopped being discussed. Spring came early in 1885. The snowmelt off Greyback Ridge beginning in the second week of March rather than the fourth, which was what happened in winters when the snowpack had been substantial and the March sun arrived with more conviction than expected. Dunmore Creek ran high through April, and the head gate of the Dunmore Creek ditch required attention 3 times in the first month to manage the volume. Not a problem, simply a task, the kind of task that was in the nature of the work. The alfalfa went in on schedule. The first cutting in June was the best Willa had taken in 3 years. The plants deep-rooted and responding to the full water access with the particular vigor of vegetation that has recently been reminded of what it requires. Toby was at the west corner field on a Saturday morning in early May, the kind of morning that arrives after a hard week and invites a person to move without particular purpose. He walked along the spring intake channel, where it ran above ground near the outlet, feeling the terrain with his boots the way a person learns the contours of a place by walking it in different seasons and accumulating a sense of it that cannot be gotten any other way. The cattails were back. New growth, pale green and not yet at height, pushing through the wet ground at the outlet with the uncomplicated certainty of plants that know the water is going to keep arriving. He crouched beside them and confirmed what he already knew, that the outlet was running at its expected spring rate, slightly higher than the winter baseline, adjusted for the early melt. He wrote it in the notebook: date, flow condition, cattail growth status. The same kind of entry his father had kept for the alfalfa and the ditch, and that he had kept for this particular patch of ground since December of 1883, which was before anyone had understood what the ground was telling him. Willa came out to the west corner field mid-morning and found him there. She did not call him in. She stood at the edge of the outlet channel and looked at the cattails and at the water moving through the stone-faced outlet with the steadiness it had possessed since October, and would, Cormac had told them, possess for as long as the ridge held snow. She was not thinking about Fitch or the commission ruling or the redesigned allotment or the procedural reform that carried her family's water dispute into Wyoming Territory's administrative record. She was thinking about the people who had built this in 1849, with tools she had never held, and knowledge that had taken them a lifetime to accumulate, who had not built it to win an argument or establish a precedent or demonstrate anything to anyone. They had built it because the water was there, and the land was there, and the people who would come after them would need both. And the most useful thing a person could do with that understanding was cut the stone to the correct grade and fit it correctly, and leave it for the next generation to maintain. That was what Toby was doing in the notebook. Not recording for himself. Recording so that whoever came after him would know what to look for and where to look for it, because the ground did not announce itself, and the water did not wait for people to be ready, and the only protection against losing what was yours was knowing exactly what you had. She turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, leaving him to his work. Behind her, the water ran. The cattails stood in the early May light, and her son sat beside them writing down what he saw, and the spring kept doing what it had done through every season since before any of them were born, moving through stone in the dark, following the grade that someone had calculated correctly the first time, finding its way to the surface, and arriving.